could pluck off the ground was a whole different ballgame. Gold was money, the universal equivalent, good for buying basically anything anywhere you could buy things, which at the time was more of the world every day. The allure to opportunistic settlers was unmatchable. There was money on the ground. Men, and the settler population was almost all men, dropped what they were doing and headed for the gold fields. Boats stacked up abandoned in the harbor as crews disappeared up the river. Settlers hiked down from the Oregon Territory up north. No boss made as good an offer as California's waterways did in the early days of the gold rush. Using pans with ridges patterned on Indian baskets, the miners filtered rivers and streams, dragging gold-flecked sediment through their hands. As it turned out, the world center of cultural and biological diversity was also full of generic gold, and whites couldn't get enough. The 49ers destroyed the Alta California Indian life world in a different and much more comprehensive manner than the Spanish and Mexican settlers did. Unlike the ranchers, the surface miners needed little capital for overhead, and they had an incentive to spread quickly. With their complex societies, Indians lived off the land efficiently, communing abundantly in small territories for countless generations. Gold mining is much the opposite. Single-mindedly exhausting territory and moving on to the next as fast as possible, extracting and piling inorganic, non-replenishing nuggets and dust until it seems like it might be easier to get it somewhere else. Instead of cycling with the seasons, mining moved linearly, exponentially, cumulatively. There is no such thing as enough gold. The 49ers disregarded the Mexican land grants, which the United States promised to respect according to the treaty between the two countries, pushing the descendants of Spanish colonists off the good spots. Claim jumping was par for the course for stream bed placer miners, and the first jumped claims belonged to the Indians. As violent whites crowded them off their land, California's indigenous peoples lost the basis for their shared existence. In their place, white men found a basis for their own. Gold rushers were not really settlers, at least most of them didn't think of themselves that way. They were there to stack up gold and go back, or onward, rich. Even after the state's inaugural constitution, itself a rogue affair, and California's quick incorporation as a free state to balance Texas in the Compromise of 1850, the men weren't coming to stay, and their behavior reflected that. Greed and opportunism were an unstable basis for a society, but a war of all against all wasn't good for business either. If you spent your time jumping claims, you never got any gold. In the frontier camps, miners formed crude protocols for collective governance. Immortalized in Charles Howard Shinn's 1885 account, Mining Camps, a study in American frontier government, these temporary associations of free men settled property disputes and kept retaliatory violence between the guys under control. But this was Anglo-Californian self-government, and that hardly described the mass of miners. Gold was nearly universal, and people came in large numbers from anywhere they could. French adventurers, Chinese fortune seekers, experienced miners up from Chile and the northern Mexican region of Sonora. Difficulties with such foreigners were inevitable, Shinn writes, and they only served to weld the Americans into a closer union. Excluding foreigners and Indians from gold claims became a raison d'etre for the miner councils, and then for the Golden State government itself. From the beginning, the state of California was a whiteness cartel, defining national belonging in relation to territorial access. In 1850, the state passed the Foreign Miners Tax Act, assessing a monthly rent for access to the land, putting everyone else at a comparative disadvantage. It wasn't a bad deal for, say, French miners, who could, for a fee, secure claims that in former days the Anglos might have simply bullied them off of. But the protections didn't apply universally. the state's civil and criminal procedural codes excluded testimony from Indians and black people in cases involving white people. The testimony ban ensured that non-whites could not protect themselves from white predation, that they had no claim a white man was bound to respect. In 1853, George Hall appealed his conviction for the murder of miner Ling Sing to the California Supreme Court, and the judges ruled for Hall, concurring in a ruling full of bizarre race science that the Chinese were also ineligible to testify against whites, because to allow them to do so opened the door to full civic equality. The result was that California's whites were legally permitted to kill non-whites as long as no other whites complained. Mining camp governance and the state it birthed didn't simply quell violence. It stoked it, focused it, and organized it along racial lines. With the state endorsing white supremacy by statute, American miners turned their attacks on the Indians into a national mission. In the decades following the gold rush, these settlers murdered and plundered on their country's behalf, organizing themselves into Indian hunting militias that demanded payment from the state, which in turn demanded reimbursement from the feds. The synthesis between national power and grassroots initiative was similar to the one that drove the Bear Flag Revolt and Fremont's campaign, now with the additional state layer. The first civilian governor of California, Peter Burnett, explained in his 1851 State of the State address that the white man, to whom time is money, and who labors hard all day to create the comforts of life, cannot sit up all night to watch his property. And after being robbed a few times, he becomes desperate and resolves upon a war of extermination. He provided direct support for the genocidal project with an 1855 law that assessed an annual 25-cent tax on all fighting-age white men who didn't join a militia, a tax the legislature doubled the next year. The big giveaway, however, was federal. The 1855 Bounty Land Act offered 160 acres to any soldier or militia member who fought for 2 weeks or more. Predictably, California militias embarked on rinky-dink expeditions against unarmed Indians, killing a few at a time and confiscating land. With these land grants, settlers saw a future in California, and they advanced inland and north, driving an increasing number of tribal communities from territory that the militiamen then received in payment. The Bounty Land Act was a prelude to the 1862 Homestead Act, which offered the same 160 acres to settlers who spent 5 years improving the land, drawing an equivalence with 2 weeks of Indian killing. And the federal government sent hundreds of thousands of dollars to the state to pay California's war debt, thanks to the support of Louisiana Senator and future Confederate Secretary of State, Judah P. Benjamin. It was a particularly American mode of legalized conquest, plot by plot. On the stolen land, miners planted wheat, barley, and oats, not as valuable as gold, though similarly generic, but the population wasn't set up for a plantation economy. To become gentlemen farmers, the settlers needed laborers, and there weren't many around. As a result, even displaced Indians, who comprised the majority of potential wage workers, commanded high pay. The Anglos came to the same conclusion as the Swiss psychopath Johann Sutter did: forced labor, enslavement. While free workers commanded at least $1 a day, farmers could buy Indian captives from labor contractors for not much more than a month's wages, while black slaves in the South sold for upwards of $1,000 each. Planters could get kidnapped California Indians for under $100 per person. White women were nearly absent from the coast, and white men enslaved Indian women and children for domestic labor, including sex. Militia campaigns drove Indians off their lands into Anglo homes and fields. Slavery was illegal, but so was Indian testimony. And in the early 1860s, California slave raiding peaked, which, along with technological improvements in mining and wheat agriculture, finally drove down the price of Indian wage labor. By 1870, Scarcely 20 years since the initial rush, California's settlers had destroyed 80% of the California Indians by one estimate, bringing the population from 150,000 down to 30,000. Quite possibly the most extreme demographic disaster of all time, in the words of historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Commenting on the public abuse of one Indian farm laborer who was dragged behind a horse in Mendocino County in 1865, a Sacramento reporter scoffed about the supposed ban on forced labor. So much for slavery in California.